Madrid 1834. The palace corridors were unnaturally quiet, their marble floors echoing only the hurried footsteps of servants carrying sealed orders. Behind heavy doors, the royal household whispered of a death that was both expected and yet left the kingdom trembling. King Ferdinand VII of Spain had drawn his last breath, and with his passing, an entire era of turbulence, distrust, and decline was about to be sealed within the walls of the palace. But death in a royal court was rarely just an ending. It was a transition, a handover not only of crowns and scepters but also of secrets too dark to be written in official chronicles. Among those summoned to the royal chambers was a physician who had served the king for many years. His task, he was told, was not merely to confirm the monarch's passing, but to preserve a part of Ferdinand that few outside the innermost circle had ever known existed. The hush that surrounded this final duty said more about the king's reign than any proclamation ever could. To the Spanish public, Ferdinand VII had been many things. The desired one upon his return from Napoleonic captivity in 1814, the restorer of Bourbon rule, and later, the symbol of an iron-fisted restoration that rolled back the liberal constitution of Cadiz and plunged the nation into a decade of repression. Yet to those closest to him, the king was a man haunted by private afflictions, physical, psychological, and moral, that would come to define his rule as much as any law or war. His death at the age of 48 was officially attributed to complications of gout, a disease that had plagued him in his later years. But whispers in the court suggested a far more complex truth: decades of physical ailments, obsessive attempts to secure a lasting heir, and a paranoid mind worn thin by constant surveillance and betrayal. For years, the palace had operated less like a seat of enlightened rule and more like a fortress under siege, not by foreign powers alone but by the ghosts of the king's own fears. In the stillness of that final night, the royal physician recalled the arc of Ferdinand's life. From his birth in 1784 as the heir to Charles Roman IV, through the chaos of the Napoleonic invasions, to his contentious marriages and the dynastic crises that had shaken the Bourbon line. Each chapter of his reign had been marked by desperation. Desperation to secure a lineage, desperation to maintain absolute control, and desperation to suppress a rising tide of liberalism that threatened the very foundation of his power. The Spain Ferdinand left behind was not the flourishing empire of his ancestors. By the time the physician entered the silent chamber to perform his duty, the overseas colonies that had once poured gold and silver into Madrid were gone. Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, and more had broken away. The treasury was depleted. The streets of the capital still bore the scars of uprisings, and the people were weary of a crown that had promised salvation but delivered oppression. As the candlelight flickered over the lifeless figure of the monarch, one could not help but wonder, how had a man born with such promise become a ruler remembered less for his achievements than for his failures? The answer, as the physician knew too well, lay not only in the treaties signed or battles lost, but in the very nature of Ferdinand himself. His upbringing within a court steeped in nepotism and suspicion, his physical frailty that became a state secret, and his unrelenting paranoia that turned marriage into a battleground and government into an inquisition. This first chapter in the story of Ferdinand VII is not the tale of a glorious king honored by his people, but rather the opening of a case study in how personal flaws, when placed upon a throne, can ripple outward to affect millions. The task before the physician that night, discreetly preserving a controversial part of the king's anatomy for medical study, was emblematic of a reign obsessed with appearances and haunted by private torments. It was said that what he preserved that night was not just flesh, but the very symbol of a reign marked by excess, secrecy, and tragedy. Beyond the locked doors, the court was already whispering about succession. The Pragmatic sanction of 1830 had allowed his daughter, Isabella Roman II, to inherit the throne, despite fierce opposition from those who supported his brother Don Carlos. This decision would soon ignite the Carlist Wars, plunging Spain into another round of conflict. Even in death, Ferdinand's legacy was not peace, but a fracture that would bleed the country for generations. As the physician sealed away the relic entrusted to him, he could not escape a grim reflection. This was the sum of a monarch's life, not the grand monuments, not the parades of his restoration, but a secret locked in a chest, a daughter who might not even bear his blood, and a nation teetering on the edge of civil war. Ferdinand VII had sought to shape Spain in his own image, but in the end it was Spain that bore the scars of his obsessions. This moment, quiet, morbid, and steeped in unspoken truths, marks the beginning of our journey through the shadowed corridors of a reign that promised stability but delivered ruin. To understand how Spain reached this night in 1834, one must step back into the poisoned cradle that formed its king. A world of intermarriage, intrigue, and a monarchy too fragile to carry the weight of modernity. To understand the Spain that Ferdinand VII would one day rule, one must first understand the house that created him. His story did not begin in 1834, nor even in the upheavals of the Napoleonic era, but decades earlier in a palace where grandeur masked decay. Ferdinand was born on October 14, 1784, at the royal site of El Escorial, the very symbol of Spanish imperial glory. Yet the empire that had once dominated continents was already faltering, and the blood that flowed in its heir's veins carried the burden of centuries of narrow marriages and rigid dynastic policy. For generations, the Spanish Bourbons and Habsburgs had intermarried with a zeal that might have satisfied political alliances but starved the royal line of genetic renewal. Cousin wed cousin, niece was promised to uncle, and the family tree grew tangled and frail. By the late 18th century, whispers of deformities and nervous maladies circulated not only in Madrid, but in every court that watched Spain with calculating eyes. Ferdinand was a child of this web. His father, Charles Roman IV, and his mother, Maria Luisa of Parma, were first cousins. From the cradle, the boy was marked as both the heir to a crumbling empire and the product of choices made not for health, but for power. The court he grew up in was not one of stability or virtue. Charles Roman IV, though not an evil man, preferred the hunt to the council chamber. Maria Luisa, his mother, was notorious for her appetites, political and personal, and for her intimate association with Manuel de Godoy, the favorite who effectively governed Spain in the waning years of the 18th century. Young Ferdinand witnessed this triangle of weakness, influence, and betrayal from behind the gilded curtains of the Escorial, and it etched into his character a deep mistrust of intimacy and authority alike. From early adolescence, courtiers and tutors noted a boy who seemed to live in the tension between humiliation and ambition. Rumors about his health circulated. Some said he suffered from a congenital abnormality that might hinder his future as a husband and father. Others whispered of psychological oddities, sudden rages, prolonged silences, and an almost pathological obsession with how others perceived him. Whether these were the natural products of a sickly constitution or the learned behaviors of a child raised in a nest of gossip is impossible to say. What is certain is that Ferdinand learned to watch, to wait, and to harbor resentment. The royal tutors, men chosen more for loyalty than for brilliance, struggled to shape him. His education was heavy on ceremony and light on modern governance. Enlightenment ideals were seeping into Europe, revolutionary in France, reformist in parts of Italy and Germany, but in Spain they were treated as contagion. Ferdinand's lessons taught him to fear change, to distrust parliaments, and to regard the concept of shared power as a prelude to chaos. The boy absorbed this worldview readily. Surrounded by whispers about his family's frailties, he came to see control not as a means to serve, but as a shield against ridicule. One episode from his adolescence survives in the private notes of a court tutor. The young prince, upon hearing servants laugh in a distant corridor, flew into a rage, convinced that their amusement was directed at him. He demanded their dismissal, and when the king hesitated, withdrew into sullen silence for weeks. These were not yet the acts of a tyrant, but they were the seeds of one, a youth convinced that mockery lurked in every bow, that loyalty was a mask worn by those who plotted behind closed doors. The Spain of Ferdinand's youth was also a land of contradictions. Vast in territory yet hollow in wealth, devout in public yet riddled with private corruption, it stood at the threshold of an age that demanded reform but clung to ceremony. Into this unstable world stepped a boy with a fragile ego and a sense of entitlement inherited rather than earned. His childhood, far from preparing him to navigate the storms ahead, armed him only with suspicion and a desperate desire to assert dominance where he felt weakest. As he grew toward manhood, these traits hardened. The abnormality whispered about in medical letters became the shadow behind every arranged marriage negotiation. Potential brides were vetted not only for alliances, but for their willingness to accommodate a prince rumored to be difficult. At the same time, the court factionalized around him. Some saw in Ferdinand a chance to reform the monarchy through a younger generation, others regarded him as a pawn to be used against his father and Godoy. This is the Ferdinand who would face the coming upheavals of Europe, not a visionary reformer, but a young man shaped by a decaying dynasty, mistrustful of counsel, and already skilled in the art of appearing agreeable while plotting revenge. The child who watched servants whisper would grow into a monarch who saw conspiracy in every shadow. His private burdens, whatever their exact nature, did not fade with maturity. They fermented, turning shame into paranoia and vulnerability into cruelty. Thus, before a single battle was fought or a constitution torn apart, the reign of Ferdinand VII was being forged in the secretive corridors of his childhood. Spain would pay the price for a bloodline that valued purity over vitality, and for a court that raised a boy to fear humiliation more than he loved his people. By the turn of the 19th century, the world beyond Spain's borders was convulsing. Revolutions had upended thrones, and Napoleon Bonaparte's armies were redrawing the map of Europe with ruthless efficiency. While kings fell and republics rose, Madrid remained a court of ornate rituals and hollow grandeur, outwardly serene, inwardly rotting. It was in this fragile setting that Ferdinand, now heir apparent, began his first maneuvers toward power. The twilight of Charles' Roman IV reign was marked by humiliation. Spain, once a titan of the seas, had become a client state of France, dragged into conflicts it could neither afford nor win. The defeat at Trafalgar in 1805 was more than a naval disaster. It was a symbolic confirmation of decline. While Britain ruled the waves, Spain's empire cracked at the edges. In the Americas, whispers of independence began to gather force, carried on the winds of Enlightenment ideals and resentment of Bourbon mismanagement. At home, famine stalked the countryside and corruption fattened the privileged few. The monarchy's legitimacy was eroding and the young prince knew it. Ferdinand's relationship with his father was poisoned by mistrust. Charles Roman IV, under the spell of his favorite Manuel de Godoy, saw conspiracies everywhere and not without reason. Godoy, elevated from obscure origins to the pinnacle of power, became the most hated man in Spain. To liberals, he was the tyrant's instrument. To conservatives, a usurper undermining tradition. To Ferdinand, he was something worse, the barrier between himself and the throne. Every decree signed by Godoy was, to Ferdinand's mind, an affront to royal blood. The prince began cultivating allies among those who despised Godoy. Disgruntled nobles, ambitious generals, and disillusioned clerics formed a silent network around him. They whispered of restoring honor to the crown, of freeing Spain from French domination, and of placing Ferdinand, not Charles, at the helm. But beneath the patriotic rhetoric lay personal vendettas and naked ambition. Ferdinand himself was no liberal reformer. His idea of salvation was not constitutional monarchy, but absolute power in his own hands. He was willing to promise anything, so long as it brought him closer to the throne. The plot that emerged from this intrigue would later be known as the El Escorial Conspiracy of 1807. Its aim was clear: to depose Charles Roman IV and rid Spain of Godoy's influence. Its method, however, was a blend of recklessness and naivete. Ferdinand, emboldened by secret correspondence with Napoleon, imagined the French emperor as an ally in his quest. He believed that Bonaparte, master of Europe, would smile upon his bid for kingship in exchange for continued Spanish loyalty. What Ferdinand failed to grasp was that Napoleon harbored plans of his own, plans in which the Bourbon dynasty was merely a disposable pawn. When the conspiracy was discovered, the drama unfolded like a tragic farce. Letters in Ferdinand's own hand, pleading for Napoleon's support, fell into the grasp of his enemies. The prince who had fancied himself a liberator now appeared a traitor to his father and a dupe of the French. Summoned before the king and queen, Ferdinand collapsed into abject submission. He disowned his allies, signed confessions, and begged for forgiveness with humiliating tears. Dozens of conspirators paid with exile or imprisonment. Ferdinand, heir to the throne, escaped with little more than disgrace, proof that blood still counted for more than loyalty in Bourbon Spain. Yet even in disgrace, Ferdinand emerged stronger than before. Public opinion, inflamed by years of Godoy's arrogance, rallied to the prince. Pamphlets circulated depicting him as the victim of a tyrannical minister and a corrupt court. The same people who had cursed his weakness now hailed him as El Deseado, the desired one. It was a triumph not of merit but of perception, and Ferdinand understood the lesson well. In politics, survival was not about honor but about timing and the art of playing victim. That art would serve him when the storm finally broke. In 1808, as Napoleon's armies crossed the Pyrenees under the guise of alliance, Charles Roman IV and his son were swept into a vortex of intrigue that ended with the abdication of both. The throne of Spain passed not to Ferdinand, but to Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's brother and the Bourbon heir, found himself a captive in France. Yet captivity would prove less a curse than an opportunity. While patriots bled in the Peninsular War, Ferdinand cultivated his image from afar, a symbol of resistance, a martyr for Spanish independence, even as he plotted not liberty but restoration. When he returned in 1814, it would be to the cheers of a nation that imagined him its savior. They would soon learn the truth. The man they had longed for was not a deliverer, but a ruler forged in betrayal and steeped in the lessons of intrigue. The boy who once cowered before his father's wrath had grown into a monarch who trusted no one, forgave nothing, and viewed power as the only cure for humiliation. But before Ferdinand could wear the crown without rivals, he would fight another battle, one waged not on fields of war but in the chambers of matrimony. For if his political failures could be masked with propaganda, his private struggles would not yield so easily. And it was in the secrecy of his marriages that the fractures of his character would widen into chasms, shaping both his dynasty and his nation's fate. When Ferdinand VII returned to Spain in 1814, his throne awaited him, but his legacy was far from secure. A king without an heir was a king whose crown rested on shifting sand, and in the volatile climate of post-Napoleonic Europe, lineage was as crucial as legitimacy. The Bourbons needed continuity, yet Ferdinand's private life would prove to be a battleground as destructive as any war. His first marriage, arranged long before his return, had already ended in tragedy. Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily, his cousin, had shared with him a youth of political uncertainty and whispered expectations. Their union, formalized in 1802 when both were still teenagers, carried the weight of dynastic calculation rather than affection. At first, the marriage held the promise of strengthening ties with the Neapolitan Bourbons. But behind the ornate facades of the Madrid palaces, the relationship descended into strain and silence. Maria Antonia's health was frail, her upbringing deeply religious, and her understanding of marriage confined to duty. Within a few short years, the pressures of court life, the stress of political upheaval, and the constant scrutiny over their failure to produce an heir took a devastating toll. Miscarriages, illness, and whispered accusations poisoned their bond. When she died in 1806 at just 21, the official court bulletins cited fever and weakness. The private letters of those close to her spoke of exhaustion and despair. Ferdinand, then still a prince, interpreted her death less as a personal loss than as a political setback, a failure in the dynastic ledger. After his restoration to the throne, the urgency to remarry became a matter of state. Spain, still reeling from war and colonial collapse, needed a future. The second marriage to Maria Isabel of Portugal in 1816 was arranged with speed and diplomatic precision. Isabel was young, of royal blood, and importantly proven fertile through her lineage. Yet the union proved as ill-fated as the first. The pressures of expectation, Ferdinand's declining health, and the oppressive climate of his court combined to turn their marriage into another chapter of disappointment. Isabel's 2-year tenure as queen was marked by rumors of ill treatment and a series of unsuccessful pregnancies. Her death in 1818, officially attributed to nervous exhaustion, deepened the growing perception that the Spanish crown was cursed. The third attempt came with Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony in 1819. By now, Ferdinand was aging, the Spanish Empire was crumbling, and European courts were wary. Maria Josepha, 24 and better, prepared for the demands of royal duty, approached her marriage with a clinical resolve. She brought with her physicians, advisors, and a sense of resignation. The court, desperate for stability, invested in their union every hope of continuity. For a decade, their relationship became a routine of formal attempts, scheduled encounters, and mounting frustration. At last, in 1829, she conceived a daughter delivered prematurely who survived only a few hours. Maria Josepha died soon after, leaving Ferdinand once more a widower, now shadowed by grief and suspicion. These repeated failures were not merely personal tragedies, they were crises of state. Each death removed a potential link in the Bourbon chain. Each miscarriage or failed pregnancy fueled whispers of divine disfavor or of some hidden affliction in the king himself. Court physicians alternated between caution and desperation, commissioning remedies, rituals, and consultations from across Europe. Alchemists offered potions, clergy offered prayers, and foreign specialists whispered promises of success. All proved fruitless. The final act in this dynastic drama unfolded with Maria Christina of Naples, whom Ferdinand married in 1829. By then, his health was in irreversible decline and his desperation was evident. Maria Christina was already pregnant when she entered the Spanish court, a fact known to some but overlooked in the rush to secure a successor. In 1830, she gave birth to Isabella Roman II, the daughter who would inherit the crown and ignite the Carlist Wars over her legitimacy. Through these marriages runs a common thread. Urgency turned to obsession, and obsession turned to cruelty. Ferdinand, haunted by the fear of a dying line, imposed expectations his own body and circumstances could not fulfill. The court, complicit and fearful, enabled a cycle of forced unions and concealed disappointments. Wives became instruments of policy, their health collateral in a dynasty's desperate gamble. The failure to secure a stable succession weakened the monarchy from within. Rivals, especially his brother Don Carlos, seized upon the uncertainty to rally conservative forces against the pragmatic sanction that recognized Isabella as heir. Liberals who had once hailed Ferdinand's return watched with growing resentment as personal dysfunction translated into political stagnation. By the late 1820s, Ferdinand was not merely a king besieged by external enemies. He was a monarch eroded by his own household. The marriages he arranged to secure the Bourbon future had instead left him surrounded by ghosts, with a daughter whose very claim to the throne would plunge Spain into civil war. In the intimacy of the royal chambers, the fate of a nation had been sealed, not by the clash of armies, but by the quiet failure of a king to fulfill the most basic duty his era demanded: to provide an heir beyond dispute. By the time Ferdinand Roman VII entered the third decade of the 19th century, Spain was no longer the sprawling power its maps pretended it to be. The golden age of galleons and global dominion had long passed, replaced by a brittle empire sustained more by memory than by might. War with Napoleon had hollowed the treasury, resistance movements had drained the army, and revolutions across the Atlantic were tearing away the most profitable provinces one after another. In this turbulent landscape, Ferdinand clung to his throne with a desperate grip, determined to restore the authority of his ancestors but unable or unwilling to adapt to a world that had moved on. The colonies, once the lifeblood of Spanish wealth, had become theaters of defiance. From Mexico to Argentina, independence movements, some inspired by Enlightenment ideals, others driven by local elites, erupted in the wake of Napoleon's invasion of Iberia. While Ferdinand languished as a prisoner in France between 1808 and 1814, the Americas tasted self-rule under liberal constitutions and revolutionary juntas. When he returned and swiftly abolished the Constitution of Cadiz, reasserting absolute monarchy, his decision alienated the very subjects who might have restored Spanish influence overseas. His reaction to these revolutions was both harsh and inconsistent. On paper, he vowed to crush the uprisings. In practice, his court was too divided, his army too weak, and his resources too thinly stretched. Expeditions were launched, most famously the doomed venture of 1820, when a liberal uprising among the troops themselves forced Ferdinand to accept a constitutional government for 3 brief years. The so-called Trienio liberal, 1820–1823, saw Spain attempt reform while the colonies slipped away irrevocably. When the French, at Ferdinand's invitation, sent the 100,000 sons of St. Louis to restore his absolute power in 1823. The war overseas was already lost. By the mid-1820s, Mexico, Peru, Colombia, Chile, and the provinces of the Rio de la Plata were independent. The once mighty fleet that had carried treasure across the Atlantic now carried refugees and faded officials back to a homeland that could scarcely support them. Havana and Manila remained as distant jewels, but the chain of empire was broken. Spain's position in Europe diminished accordingly. Britain and France now treated Madrid less as a rival and more as a relic, useful when convenient, irrelevant when not. Ferdinand, however, did not see a crumbling empire as a call to reform. To him, the loss of the colonies was evidence of treachery at home and heresy abroad. He blamed liberal conspiracies, Freemasons, and foreign plots more than his own inflexibility. His obsession with rooting out dissent led to a climate of surveillance and repression that stifled the very innovations Spain needed to recover. Universities were censored, the press muzzled, and secret police prowled the streets of Madrid. The Inquisition, officially abolished elsewhere, found unofficial echoes in the king's network of informers and judges. The domestic consequences were profound. Trade routes once buoyed by American silver now dried up, leading to shortages and inflation. Rural unrest simmered as taxes rose to fund feudal expeditions and court extravagance. Urban craftsmen, once employed in outfitting colonial fleets, faced ruin. The promise of Ferdinand's restoration, hailed by crowds in 1814 as a national rebirth, devolved into the ominous decade 1823–1833, a period marked by purges, economic stagnation, and a monarchy retreating into paranoia. Foreign powers watched with calculated patience. Britain, having secured trade dominance in the newly independent Americas, had little incentive to aid Spain's imperial revival. France, alternating between revolution and restoration, played the double game of supporting Ferdinand's repression when it served continental stability while courting Spanish liberals when it suited French influence. Austria and the Holy Alliance treated Ferdinand as a fellow reactionary monarch but offered little more than sympathetic dispatches. For the Spanish people, the empire's collapse was both distant and immediate. Distant because many peasants in Castile or Aragon had never seen the silver of Potosi or the cocoa of Caracas. Immediate because the loss of that wealth translated into empty granaries, unpaid soldiers, and a government perpetually on the brink of default. Veterans of colonial wars wandered the streets of Madrid without pensions. Merchants who had thrived on colonial monopolies now competed unsuccessfully against British shipping. Ferdinand's focus, meanwhile, remained inward on his household, on his succession, on the enemies he imagined behind every curtain. The loss of half a hemisphere did not produce reform but retreat. Instead of modernizing his administration or courting new alliances, he invested his authority in an ever-tightening grip at home, exiling dissenters, restoring reactionary councils, and binding the future of Spain to the question of who would inherit his fragile legacy. By the end of the 1820s, the Spanish Empire was a shadow of its former self, and the crown that had once claimed the Americas now ruled little more than a fractured peninsula. The king, celebrated as El Deseado upon his return, had become the architect of disappointment. The stage was set for a conflict not between colonies and crown, but between Spaniards themselves. A struggle over legitimacy, succession, and the price of clinging to a past that had already slipped away. By the time Ferdinand VII entered the final decade of his life, Spain was no longer threatened primarily by foreign invaders or distant colonies. It was threatened by the very system he had chosen to revive. The ominous decade 1823–1833, as later historians would call it, was an age defined less by war than by suffocation. A time when the weight of absolute monarchy pressed upon every profession, every town, and every conversation. Having restored his power with French bayonets, Ferdinand devoted himself not to rebuilding a shattered nation, but to ensuring that no voice could challenge his rule. The foundation of this repression lay in surveillance. Ferdinand, shaped by a childhood of whispered mockery and a youth of conspiracies, believed that treachery was ever present. His court became a maze of spies, servants who reported the habits of their masters, priests who relayed the contents of confessionals, officials who kept secret ledgers of seditious remarks overheard in taverns. Letters were intercepted. Those who spoke of constitutional reform risked exile or worse. The atmosphere was one of muffled suspicion, where loyalty was measured not in deeds but in silence. Censorship followed naturally. The printing presses that had briefly flourished during the Trienio liberal were shuttered or placed under strict royal license. Plays were edited, newspapers neutered, and universities purged of professors suspected of French ideas. What had been a cautious but promising awakening of thought in Spain was smothered by decrees and inquisitorial tribunals. The young, who had looked to the Americas or to France for models of progress, now found their futures narrowed to the corridors of bureaucracy or the cloisters of the church. Yet repression was never merely a matter of words. Ferdinand's government revived tools of coercion that many in Europe believed consigned to the past. Military courts tried civilians. Property was confiscated from liberals accused of conspiring against the throne. Religious orthodoxy was weaponized to discredit opponents. The Church, though not formally reinstating the Inquisition, became an ally in rooting out heresy, which in this context meant any notion of shared governance or limits upon the king. This machinery of control did not operate solely on the grand stage of politics. It seeped into private lives. Marriages, inheritances, even local festivals became arenas where loyalty was assessed. Those who sought favor with the crown were rewarded with offices and exemptions. Those who resisted found their businesses shuttered, their relatives conscripted, their names blackened in courtly gossip. The result was a society where ambition was tied to submission and where innovation was often a liability. Economically, the decade was one of stagnation. The empire's collapse had deprived Spain of its richest markets, and the crown's focus on policing thought diverted resources from rebuilding trade and infrastructure. Foreign merchants filled the vacuum. British and French goods flooded Spanish ports while domestic industries languished under outdated regulations and inconsistent taxes. The treasury, perpetually strained by Ferdinand's household expenditures and his security apparatus, resorted to loans and levies that further burdened the peasantry. Despite this, the king did not perceive his reign as failure. To Ferdinand, each purged professor, each silenced pamphlet was a triumph of order over chaos. He saw in the execution of dissidents not cruelty but necessity. His view of monarchy was personal, almost medieval. The king was father, the realm his household, descent a form of familial betrayal. It was a mindset that left no room for compromise, and it bred a court culture where flattery thrived and candor died. There were moments when the machinery faltered. Uprisings in Catalonia and Andalusia in the mid-1820s, though swiftly suppressed, revealed the simmering discontent beneath the surface. Secret societies, often composed of disillusioned army officers and students, plotted in the shadows. Exiles in London and Paris published manifestos calling for a return to the liberal constitution, smuggling their writings back across the Pyrenees. The king responded with heavier chains, convinced that only absolute control could prevent the nation from tearing itself apart. Ironically, this obsession with repression weakened the very monarchy it sought to protect. By alienating reformists and empowering only the most reactionary cliques, Ferdinand left his crown surrounded by courtiers too timid to speak truth and too self-interested to plan for a stable future. When he issued the Pragmatic Sanction of 1830, allowing his daughter Isabella to inherit despite Salic law favoring male succession, he did so in a court already rife with intrigue. The decision would ignite the Carlist movement, whose supporters claimed the throne for Ferdinand's brother Don Carlos and plunged Spain toward civil war. As the decade closed, the machinery of control creaked under its own weight. Informers demanded bribes, soldiers muttered in the barracks, and peasants fled their villages rather than pay mounting dues. What Ferdinand had built was not a strong state, but a brittle one, a realm outwardly orderly, inwardly exhausted. His repression had bought him time, 10 years of throne and scepter, but at a cost that would outlive him. By the early 1830s, the rigid structure Ferdinand VII had imposed on Spain was beginning to fracture. The decade that had started with triumph, his restoration to absolute rule and the crushing of liberal uprisings, was ending in doubt, debt, and decay. The very methods that had secured his throne now fed the forces that would challenge it. The ominous decade was not only a period of repression, but also a period of relentless strain. Years of censorship, purges, and surveillance had drained the nation's intellectual life and alienated a generation of soldiers, merchants, and clerics who might otherwise have supported the monarchy. Meanwhile, the economic wounds left by colonial losses continued to fester. Spain had lost the revenues of Mexico, the Andes, and the Rio de la Plata. The trade routes that once fueled its navy and funded its palaces were now in the hands of Britain and emerging republics across the Atlantic. The court tried to compensate with new taxes and forced loans, but each measure sparked fresh resentment. At the heart of this crisis stood a king aging rapidly, worn by illness and the weight of his own fears. Ferdinand's health, long fragile, declined into chronic pain, gout, and bouts of nervous agitation. He withdrew more often into his private apartments, where the machinery of his household continued to revolve around the same obsessions. The control of information, the monitoring of courtiers, and above all, the question of succession. For while Ferdinand had finally fathered, or at least officially recognized, a daughter, Isabella, in 1830, her right to inherit was contested from the moment of her birth. The Pragmatic Sanction of 1830, which allowed Isabella to become heir by overturning the traditional Salic law, was Ferdinand's most consequential political act. It signaled his determination to secure his own bloodline, real or presumed, over that of his brother Don Carlos. To liberals, this decree offered a glimmer of hope. Isabella's mother, Maria Christina of Naples, had shown cautious sympathy for reform. To hardline conservatives and Carlists, it was a betrayal, a break with tradition, a manipulation of law to favor a weak heir over a strong male alternative. This dispute did not remain confined to family quarrels. Across the provinces, factions began to form. Priests in the Basque Country and Navarre preached in favor of Don Carlos, portraying him as the true defender of faith and ancient rights. Liberal circles in Madrid whispered their cautious support for the infant princess, hoping that a regency might open space for constitutional reform. Between them stood Ferdinand, increasingly isolated, watching his court split into rival camps even as his own body failed him. Externally, the European powers observed with unease. France, now under the July monarchy of Louis Philippe, had little interest in seeing a strong Carlist alliance emerge on its southern border. Britain, intent on maintaining commercial access to Spanish markets, leaned toward supporting Maria Christina and the infant heir. Austria and the Holy Alliance remained formally sympathetic to Ferdinand but offered no substantial aid, wary of entanglement in a Spain already known for draining its allies. The countryside, meanwhile, simmered. Bands of disaffected soldiers and smugglers, many veterans of colonial wars, roamed the hills of Catalonia and Aragon. Some declaring for the Carlist cause, others simply seizing the opportunity of weak central authority. Local uprisings flared and were stamped out with severity, feeding a cycle of repression and rebellion that deepened the rift between Madrid and the provinces. Ferdinand's response to this slow-motion unraveling was neither bold reform nor outright abdication but hesitation. At times, he appeared ready to grant concessions, restoring a few municipal rights or tolerating limited press activity. At other times, he doubled down, ordering arrests and silencing suspected liberals or Carlists alike. His ministers rotated with dizzying speed, each promising to restore stability, each falling victim to the king's mistrust or the palace intrigues that thrived in its corridors. By 1832, the strain reached its peak. The king suffered a grave illness, prompting Maria Christina to issue a decree in favor of Isabella's succession. Don Carlos fled to Portugal, where he prepared to claim the throne by force if necessary. When Ferdinand recovered, briefly, he vacillated, at one moment denouncing the Carlists, at another seeking to appease them. The monarchy, so recently restored by foreign arms, now teetered between two futures, one absolutist and clerical, the other uncertainly constitutional. As 1833 dawned, the inevitability of conflict became apparent. The death of the king would no longer simply mark the end of a reign, it would ignite a civil war. The Carlist movement was ready, its preachers and commanders waiting in exile and in the hills. The liberal factions, weakened by years of persecution, prepared to gamble on a regency that might finally modernize the kingdom. Ferdinand, in his final months, was less a ruler than a hinge upon which Spain's fate would swing, too ill to govern effectively, too suspicious to delegate power, and too proud to admit that his policies had sown the seeds of the storm to come. By the final years of his reign, Ferdinand VII was a king surrounded less by courtiers than by shadows. The throne he had fought to secure, the marriages he had endured to preserve his line, and the policies he had enforced to protect his power had left him ruler of a realm exhausted, divided, and fearful. What remained of his strength was spent not on governing a changing world, but on guarding himself against imagined and real threats alike. Physically, the king was a man in decline. Years of gout, chronic pain, and untreated ailments had reduced him to a ruler who moved stiffly, often confined to chambers that smelled more of medicines than of incense. He suffered from bouts of fever and insomnia, his temper grew erratic, and his once performative charm faded into suspicion. The same paranoia that had guided his repression now settled into his private life with almost theatrical intensity. Palace corridors that once echoed with courtly ceremony now bristled with informers and guards. Ferdinand ordered secret passages built to move unseen from his apartments to those of his fourth wife, Maria Christina of Naples. Meals were delayed for hours while food tasters performed their rituals. Letters were intercepted, read, and often destroyed. Visitors were kept waiting until their loyalties were confirmed twice over. Ministers were dismissed on whispers of disloyalty, only to be recalled when new suspicions arose against their replacements. Maria Christina, who had married Ferdinand in 1829, bore the brunt of this climate. She was younger, politically cautious, and far more pragmatic than her husband. Her primary concern was securing the future of her daughter Isabella, whom Ferdinand had declared heir under the Pragmatic sanction. But this maternal focus fed the king's distrust. He alternated between treating her as a trusted regent-in-waiting and accusing her of scheming with foreign powers or liberal circles. Their marriage, though less publicly tragic than his previous unions, became a theater of constant surveillance. Servants placed to monitor her conversations, guards rotated to prevent alliances, and courtiers divided into camps by the king's favor and fear. The paranoia extended beyond the royal family. Ferdinand, convinced that conspirators lurked everywhere, issued edicts tightening censorship, strengthening the authority of secret police, and expanding the network of informants already embedded across the capital. Even ordinary gatherings, salons, parish meetings, trade councils, were viewed as potential breeding grounds for rebellion. Clergy who had once praised him as a defender of the faith began to grumble privately at the endless loyalty tests and intrusions into church affairs. Economically, the kingdom had little left to offer him in comfort. Revenues dwindled, debt mounted, and foreign creditors demanded assurances the king could not provide. Yet the palace continued its rituals of wealth, processions, feasts, and the maintenance of a sprawling household designed to project stability even as the walls trembled. This contradiction, opulence amid scarcity, deepened popular resentment. To peasants in Castile or Catalonia, the king's paranoia was not just an eccentricity, it was a burden that taxed their harvests and conscripted their sons. In his private moments, Ferdinand oscillated between defiance and fatalism. He commissioned portraits of himself with Isabella, symbols of continuity in a time of fracture. He held long, rambling audiences in his chambers, recounting betrayals past and warning of betrayals to come. At times, he ordered reviews of the palace guards in the dead of night, convinced that plots were being hatched under cover of sleep. At other times, he secluded himself for days, refusing counsel, staring at the tokens of a reign that had promised glory and delivered attrition. Foreign ambassadors who reported from Madrid in the early 1830 described a court more like a garrison than a government. They observed a monarch still capable of brief political maneuvers, such as briefly reconciling with moderate liberals when his health faltered in 1832, but increasingly incapable of sustained policy. Every step toward compromise was followed by a retreat into suspicion. Every alliance forged was shadowed by an accusation. For Maria Christina, the final years were a balancing act, maintaining her husband's fragile confidence while preparing for the inevitability of his death and the storm of the Carlist challenge that would follow. She played the role of dutiful consort, but her private correspondence, some of which survived in foreign archives, revealed a woman weary of the constant scrutiny and fearful for the future of her daughter's throne. By 1833, the once celebrated El Deseado was a king trapped in the labyrinth of his own making. The same networks of control that had silenced dissent now stifled governance. The same fear that had crushed conspiracies now bred them. As his body weakened, his obsession with succession grew more frantic, his nights longer and his circle narrower. He had outlived many of his enemies, but not the consequences of the world he had built. In the autumn of 1833, the long and troubled reign of Ferdinand VII reached its inevitable end. The king who had returned from captivity hailed as El Deseado, the desired one, was now a shadow of that triumphant figure. Years of illness had hollowed his frame, his gait had slowed to a shuffle, his voice often broke into hoarse whispers, and the rituals of monarchy had become burdens he could scarcely bear. On September 29, 1833, Ferdinand VII died at the royal palace of Madrid, leaving behind a country fractured, a crown disputed, and a legacy clouded by both rumor and silence. The days leading to his death were marked by the same atmosphere of secrecy that had defined his life. Courtiers moved through the palace with hushed urgency. Messengers rode at night between Madrid and the provinces. Physicians argued over treatments but agreed on one thing. The king's condition was beyond recovery. Maria Christina of Naples, his fourth wife and now the designated regent for their young daughter Isabella Roman II, maintained a careful vigil, grieving, calculating, and already maneuvering to protect her fragile regency against the looming threat of Don Carlos and the Carlist faction. What transpired in the private chambers during those final hours has been the subject of speculation ever since. Physicians recorded the progression of his gout and dropsy, the fevers, and the failing heart. Servants whispered of violent mood swings, of fevered rants about betrayal, and of orders issued and rescinded within the same hour. Some accounts, never officially confirmed, spoke of a final, morbid task, the preservation of a physical relic of the king, sealed away not for honor but for discretion. Whether this relic was kept for medical curiosity or for reasons too intimate to declare, it became part of the dark legend of Ferdinand VII, a symbol of a monarch whose private afflictions were as consequential as his public decrees. When the death was announced, Madrid responded not with universal mourning, but with a divided murmur. Royalists loyal to the Pragmatic sanction proclaimed allegiance to the infant Isabella, now queen in name at 3 years old. Carlists declared the succession void, rallying behind Ferdinand's brother Don Carlos as the rightful heir. Liberals, long persecuted, sensed an opening but feared another decade of bloodshed. Within weeks, Spain descended into the first of the Carlist Wars, a civil conflict that would tear the nation's provinces apart for nearly a decade. The immediate aftermath was a study in contrast. On the one hand, elaborate funerary rites unfolded, processions of priests, the tolling of bells, the embalmed body displayed beneath the vaults of El Escorial where kings of Spain had rested for centuries. On the other, clandestine negotiations raced ahead, generals pledging loyalty in exchange for titles, foreign ambassadors pressing for recognition of the Regency, emissaries of Don Carlos slipping across borders to muster support in the north. Maria Christina, now Queen Regent, understood the stakes. To preserve her daughter's throne, she issued decrees of limited reform, loosening censorship slightly, recalling some exiles, negotiating with moderate liberals whose support she had once watched her husband suppress. Yet every gesture toward compromise risked alienating the Carlists, whose rhetoric of true faith and ancient law resonated with rural clergy and conservative militias. The realm Ferdinand left behind was not only divided, it was armed. Among the people, memory of the dead king was ambivalent. In the cities, merchants and craftsmen remembered his taxes and restrictions. In the countryside, peasants recalled conscriptions and the heavy hand of royal officers. To his defenders, Ferdinand remained the monarch who had resisted Napoleonic domination and preserved the monarchy against revolutionary tides. To his critics, he was the architect of repression, a ruler who had sacrificed an empire and a generation's hopes to his own fear and indecision. The secret relic, whether myth, exaggeration, or hidden truth, passed quietly into the vaults of history. Some claimed it was preserved in a sealed jar in the Royal Academy of Medicine, Others believed it was destroyed in the years of war that followed. Whatever its fate, it served as a fitting metaphor for a reign haunted by what could not be spoken. A king's private frailty, concealed behind a public theater of strength, and a nation forced to bear the consequences of that dissonance. Ferdinand VII's death did not close the book on his influence. It opened a darker chapter. The civil war that followed was fought as much in his shadow as in the name of his heirs. The Carlist movement invoked his bloodline even as they denounced his last will. Liberals rebuilt their cause upon the ruins of his absolutism. And in the midst of it all, the memory of the man, paranoid, persistent, often cruel, sometimes pitiable, lingered in the palaces he had fortified and the laws he had twisted. Thus, the king who had sought to make his dynasty unassailable instead left it in permanent dispute. His life's work to control the narrative, suppress the opposition, and secure his name had achieved only one certainty: that his reign would be remembered less for its victories than for the conflicts it unleashed. When the dust of civil war began to settle, and the name of Ferdinand VII passed from the proclamations of his enemies to the chronicles of historians, a question lingered. What precisely had his reign left Spain? Few monarchs in European history have been as fiercely contested in memory. Hailed as a savior upon his return in 1814, cursed as a tyrant in his final years, and remembered by later generations as a man who preserved a crown but squandered a nation. His legacy cannot be measured only in the palaces he adorned or the rituals he revived. It lies in the deeper fracture he left behind, a Spain torn between two visions of its future. On one side, the absolutist cause embodied by the Carlists sought to defend the ancient union of throne and altar, rejecting the modernizing impulses that had swept through Europe. On the other, a coalition of liberals and constitutionalists, weary of repression yet wary of chaos, sought to build a state in which monarchy might coexist with reform. Ferdinand, by clinging so stubbornly to the past while making just enough concessions to ignite rival claims, ensured that neither side would triumph without bloodshed. Economically, his reign marked the definitive end of Spain as a global empire. When he ascended to the throne, the loss of colonies was already underway. When he died, the map of Spanish America was almost entirely rewritten. His policies, vacillating between harsh repression and reluctant recognition, neither stemmed the tide nor replaced it with a viable new strategy. Trade, industry, and infrastructure stagnated while Britain and France turned the Americas into their economic sphere of influence. The wealth that once fueled the Spanish fleet became a memory, and the monarchy he fought to protect became dependent on foreign loans and fragile alliances. Socially, the ominous decade left scars that endured well beyond the 1830s. Universities lost a generation of teachers, presses lost a generation of writers, peasants bore the weight of taxes and levies that had funded a machinery of control rather than a program of renewal. The promises of the liberal constitution of 1812, briefly alive during the Trienio liberal, were smothered, only to resurface in the Carlist Wars as rallying cries for both sides. One demanding a return to the old order, the other pressing for a future Ferdinand had never allowed to take root. And yet to dismiss Ferdinand VII merely as a villain is to miss the strange, contradictory forces that shaped his reign. He was a man born into a dynasty already in decline, shaped by a childhood of political humiliation and a youth of conspiracies. He inherited a throne that was both coveted and compromised, a court where loyalty was transactional and betrayal commonplace. His paranoia was not born in a vacuum. It was the survival mechanism of a prince raised amid intrigue and unleashed upon a country that had hoped for deliverance. His defenders point to his resilience, a monarch who, despite captivity, exile, and revolution, returned to power and kept the Bourbon dynasty alive. His detractors point to the cost: decades of lost opportunity, civil strife, and a political culture that rewarded submission over vision. Both are correct in their way. Ferdinand VII was not a reformer, nor a reformer in disguise. He was a survivor, and in surviving, he reshaped the struggles of a nation around the narrow terms of his own insecurities. The secret often whispered about his private life, the preserved relic said to testify to a physical affliction, remains more legend than confirmed fact, but as metaphor it endures. It symbolizes the way Ferdinand's personal limitations became public burdens. a monarchy obsessed with reproduction because it feared extinction, a ruler obsessed with control because he feared humiliation, a nation that bore the weight of a king's hidden shame. When his daughter Isabella Roman II eventually ascended the throne, she inherited not a stable kingdom but a battleground. The Carlist Wars would rage in his name and against his will, tearing apart provinces he had ruled with an iron hand. The constitutional experiments that followed were built not on fertile ground, but on the rubble of a decade in which talent fled, wealth drained, and trust decayed. Today, Ferdinand Roman VII is remembered neither as a great conqueror nor as a tragic reformer undone by fate, but as a monarch emblematic of a fading era. Too rigid to modernize, too fearful to share power, too determined to control a future that slipped through his fingers nonetheless. His reign stands as a cautionary tale of how a king can win the throne yet lose the nation, how secrets can become policies, and how survival, pursued without vision, can lead not to legacy but to limbo. In the end, the crown remained, the empire did not. The Bourbon name endured, the confidence of the people did not. And the man who once believed he was the linchpin of Spain's salvation is now remembered as one of the architects of its long 19th-century turmoil. A king who feared change more than he feared defeat, and who thus left behind a country perpetually at war with its own future.